So my paper is, well, will you introduce me?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. So, okay. So I chose this topic because my family has some personal background in the area of war and whether or not to fight. One of my grandfathers was actually forced to fight in Nazi Germany, so I decided to address sort of that issue of morality in war, when a person is forced to fight and whether that's moral or not. And my other grandfather was drafted in the war in Vietnam, and he chose not to fight because of the pacifist doctrines of his church. So I really wanted to find out what the Bible has to say about this and what the Christian answer is to this issue. So I'll begin. Chris Kyle was an expert sniper. His sure aim served him well in Iraq, where he fought during the U.S. war in that country. Therefore, when Kyle was trying to help a fellow ex-Marine named Eddie Ray Routh, who had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, he decided to take him to a shooting range so they could both practice their aim together. However, Kyle's decision turned deadly. Eddie Routh turned on Kyle and another man and killed both of them in the ensuing shooting. Routh was arrested and faced capital murder charges. On that note, Dr. Sharon McEwen, psychologist at the San Francisco Veteran Affairs Medical Center, she discusses PTSD and war and the relationship between them. And she cites a medical study saying that, quote, killing could be the potent ingredient in predicting PTSD, unquote. Jacob G. Hornberger, founder and president of the Future Freedom Foundation, postulates that Eddie Routh's mental problems were the result of guilt, massive unresolved guilt at the wrongful killing of other human beings. And that was a quote. Killing in war can be related to mental problems involving guilt. And Dr. McEwen also says, quote, killing is associated with a number of health and mental problems, or mental health and functioning problems, unquote. And this claim is supported by the high suicide rates among U.S. veteran soldiers. According to a report from Forbes, as of February 5th, 2013, 22 veterans killed themselves per day. This means that for every single soldier killed in combat, an average of 25 veterans kill themselves. I do acknowledge that there are many factors involved in veteran suicides other than war killing, as well as in mental orders and PTSD. However, from the information I gave just now, it is clear that some, if not many, war-related PTSD cases are related to killing in war. This brings the morality of wartime killing into question, and it is this question of morality that I wish to address in this speech. Should we, as Christians, ever be called upon to participate in war or desire to serve as a soldier, would it be morally justifiable for us to join the military and fight? Or would it be acceptable for a believer to take on a position in the military as employment? Some Christian denominations say that Christians are not allowed to fight in war at all, and I'll refer to them as pacifists. And they say this because of the peacemaking nature of the Christian faith and the peaceful teaching of the Bible. I will explore what the Bible has to say on this issue, and I believe that is this, and I'll support this later on, and that Christians are biblically justified in killing during a time of war. I will demonstrate the validity of my thesis by examining 1. Biblical Christian virtues in the office of the soldier, 2. The morality of war killing and the issue of guilt, and 3. The numerous biblical examples of believers fighting in war and believing soldiers throughout the Bible. So my first argument is that the office of a soldier does not violate God's law in and of itself. Now, I would like to first deal with the literal translation of the word used in the 7th commandment, which reads, quote, you shall not murder, unquote. John MacArthur states that careful appraisal of the word Moses used suggests a broad translation of to kill or slay, and I was quoting him there. However, not all killing is outlawed. MacArthur goes on to write that the 7th commandment deals with, quote, the taking of life under a legal system where the killer would have to answer to the stipulations of a legal code, no matter whether he killed unintentionally or intentionally. unquote. Therefore, the seventh commandment was dealing with murder, not other types of killing, such as that which takes place in war. And therefore, killing in war is not prohibited by the Ten Commandments. And then Martin Luther demonstrated that the Christian can legitimately become a soldier. He asked, quote, "Why does anyone go to war except that he desires peace and obedience?" Unquote. Luther used the analogy of a physician to illustrate his belief that Christians are indeed justified in going to war. Sometimes a doctor, in the course of his occupation, would find it necessary to amputate a limb from a patient. Now, from the patient's point of view, that doctor isn't being a very kind person. I mean, the person is losing a limb, maybe, which is rather useful in everyday life. However, from the point, quote, when looked at from the point of view of the body, which the doctor intends to save, it turns out that the doctor is a fine and true man, and does a work that is good and Christian as far as it goes, unquote. This analogy illustrates the validity of the office of a soldier. In itself, it is a fine job. The soldier fights for what he believes, for his country, his family, and his home. Therefore, the job of a soldier is not inherently bad. In fact, if employed by a godly man in a godly manner, it is a godly office. If the Christian man uses his office and the responsibilities that come with that in a godly manner, then he is using that position correctly and is thus honoring God through his work. Despite the validity of the idea of a Christian soldier, the issue of guilt still remains. I'd like to cite Romans chapter 12, verse 2, which reads, quote, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God," unquote. Now, you may ask me, what does this have to do with anything? And that is this, that a correct understanding of the Word of God, the believing soldier's heart will be transformed by the renewing of his mind, and this includes a correct understanding of the fact that he is not guilty before God of murder as when he kills in war. To illustrate this point, I'd like to use the example of Alvin York. York was a very belligerent young man who had come to Christ, but his church preached a strict pacifist doctrine. Therefore, when he was drafted into the U.S. military during World War I, York was tormented with the decision that he had to make, whether to fight or to not fight. After a careful examination of what the Bible had to say, York chose to fight and returned from the war a decorated military hero. And he based his decision to fight off of the verse in which Jesus applied this to taxes, but he said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's." And York saw that as he was drafted into the army, he owed this obedience to his government, and therefore he took Jesus' words to apply to his situation as well. And York's story illustrates the fact that the Christian man can participate in war and even kill in it, and be led by the Bible through whatever guilt he may feel as a result of wartime killing. So I will now address the objections to my view, which hold that the Christian is not biblically justified in participating in war. And I'm going to refer to those who oppose my view as pacifists. And I know that pacifists can refer to a much broader range of objections to self-defense or to fighting, but I'm going to use it strictly to refer to the position that the Christian can't kill in war. So the first pacifist objection is that fighting in war seems to contradict the biblical commands for how believers are supposed to act. There are many references throughout the New Testament to peacemaking, such as in Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, which states, quote, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God," unquote. Another passage which seems to support the pacifist position is Romans chapter 12, verses 17 through 19. And I'm going to quote an excerpt so that I don't get lost with the whole passage. And that is, quote, "If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath," unquote. I would first like to point out that the commands in these passages were issued on a personal level. We, as Christians, are not supposed to revenge ourselves on personal enemies or on those who, for example, Jesus said, if a man strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. so we are not to take personal vengeance. However, fighting in war is not a breach of the peacemaking commandments because fighting in war is not carried out on a personal level. The soldier is not perpetrating personal vengeance, but instead participating in a governmental conflict. And we'll see the applications of this in just a little bit. Therefore, the commands to peacemaking issued on a personal level do not apply to the soldier as long as he is acting in accordance with his duty. It would be wrong for him to use his position to effect personal vengeance, but so long as he does not, he is not in violation of the Bible's commands. And the second pacifist objection that I will cite is voiced by John D. Roth, who maintains that the life of Jesus sets a standard for Christian living, and that because Jesus never participated in war in his time on earth, Christians should not either. It is true that Jesus did not participate in war in his time on earth. Now, Jesus is, however, and always has been, and always will be God. Therefore, he as God has commanded his followers to participate in war throughout history. And therefore, he approved of his followers to fight in war. Along the line of this argument, I would like to cite the writer of Ecclesiastes, who says, quote, "For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time of war and a time of peace. Therefore, it is clear that, according to the Bible, Christians are allowed to fight in war." And my third argument is drawn from the numerous biblical accounts of believing men who participated in war, and were even commanded by God to do so. The first of these men, whom I will mention, is Abraham, who was, quote, "the father of all who believe," unquote. Abraham was obviously a believer, and a Christian before Christ, you could say. So he was an Old Testament believer. He believed God, and God counted it to him as righteousness. However, in a slightly less well-known passage, found in Genesis 14, an alliance of kings who fought against the rulers of Sodom and Gomorrah and their allies. They captured Lot, who was Abraham's nephew, and all of his possessions. Abraham, when he was informed of this defeat and capture, immediately called together and armed his servants, who were trained for combat, and then defeated the former victors in a surprise attack. He recovered his nephew and his nephew's family and wealth. After that, he was praised by Melchizedek, who was God's priest. And I'd also like to cite the example of David, who was also clearly a believer, quote, "a man after God's own heart," unquote. However, he obviously engaged in many, numerous, almost countless military expeditions. He killed giants, and one has only to peruse the accounts of his life in the Bible to see that he was a man of God, but he was also a man of war. So I'd like to conclude by saying that there have been innumerable wars throughout history, and there will continue to be wars up until the end of time. It is therefore important for Christians to know, should they be called upon to fight in war, or should they desire an occupation as a soldier, whether they are biblically justified in doing so. I contend that they are because of the legitimacy of the idea of the Christian soldier, which I illustrated through an explanation of the vocabulary in the biblical commandment, and also Luther's explanation of that. And also because of the numerous examples of men of God in the Bible whom God commanded and commended for going to war. And I would also like to point out how this issue is applicable today. We as Christians, since we know what the Bible says about this issue, should comfort soldiers who are struggling with the morality of wartime killing, and show them what the Bible has to say about this issue. Second, the fact that many Christians support the idea of a Christian killing in war can almost seem like a contradiction at face value, and may even serve as a deterrent from the Christian faith for those who do not believe. And here I am speaking from a strictly human viewpoint, because we know that it is God who regenerates the heart. So even though it is not a core doctrine, it can almost push people away from the faith. However, therefore, a Christian must know how to defend this biblical position and show that it is not in contradiction to the peacemaking commands of the Bible. And in this way, this issue is also applicable today. So I am done. Thank you.
Good timing.
Thanks.
How many minutes?
14:53.
Wow.
I
And
saw,
I loved the pace. It was
Okay.
very natural and that's good.
I saw him, like, he signaled that I had 3 minutes left, so I cut out a bit of my last contention so that I'd have time. But okay, questions? Were you going to ask the question that I addressed in my conclusion?
I might have been.
Okay.
Your mom has a question.
Yes, Mom?
What if I was a Christian living in Russia and we were about to invade America?
Okay. Well, I mean, we'd be kind of opposed to that because, you know, we're Americans. But, so, I guess you're asking, what if a Christian is involved in a war that is wrong?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you're put, we live in America and so far we've had a pretty decent government.
Uh.
But what if you got placed you somewhere else that didn't have such a great government?
Mhm. Okay, yeah, and this just popped into my mind. I'm going to use the illustration of David. When he was being persecuted by Saul, he went into he fled to the Philistines, and he actually occasionally would perform military expeditions for them. Very often, sometimes he would work against them, right, Philistine towns. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is that is the choice of the individual Christian, and that he should pray about that, see what God's will is on that. And also, I addressed this in my paper, but the fault of that military engagement would rest primarily on the government, because it's the government's action. However, the soldier could be implicated in that guilt, and therefore he should prayerfully consider whether or not he's going to fight. Does that sufficiently answer the question?
I don't know that I have a good answer for that.
No, it's fine. I'm supposed to, so. Yeah.
I know this wasn't the main topic of your paper, and this is kind of where she was talking about, but are Christians justified in fighting an unjust war? Should Christians fight in unjust wars?
Yeah, like you said, that's not the point of what most of my research was spent on, but I would like to point out that Augustine's just war theory, which is for the most part what Christians agree to, provides 3 points of analysis for the war. Only one of them is before the war, so intentions for the war. The second is conduct within the war, and the third is the conclusion of the war, whether the war aims were achieved. So I'd like to point out that 2 of those are during and after the war. So you can't necessarily determine whether a war is just or whether a certain side is just during the war. Does that make sense? And does that sort of answer your question?
I'd say it does some, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure you should really ask them if that answers your question.
Okay.
Because then
Then they could say no.
Then they have to sit there and figure out if it answers the question.
Okay. But you think that was a sufficient reply? Wow, I'm amazed I remembered that. Because we read that in Mrs. McCrae's class.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you may want to jot that down in your notes.
Yeah. Can I borrow it?
I'm always borrowing them. In fact, I probably even have some of your pencils.
Okay. You look like you have a question.
I'm trying to conclude one, but
I don't know.
Yes, Mom?
Should America, or any government for that matter, allow pacifists to abstain from war?
That's not the bulk of my research again, but that's, yeah, a very good question.
In several instances, let people go home who did not
Yeah.
want to fight.
Yes, that's a very good point. And I'd also like to bring up the example of Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan. He held very biblical beliefs. And he was obviously a military genius who participated in war. However, he advocated a not terribly popular view at that time of freedom of conscience. So once he was in power, he chose not to persecute those who disagreed with him, as many others would have. So along those same lines, we should allow others who hold pacifist doctrines to abstain from war or follow their beliefs, I think.
So, under what circumstances would a Christian not be justified in participating in the war?
Well, the Christian, I'm not trying to lay out the particulars of whether, like a checklist, A, B, or C, the Christian shouldn't fight, I am trying to point out that the Christian is justified in fighting in war. However, you do bring up a very good point, and that's why I mentioned in here, the Christian should prayerfully seek what the Bible has to say on his specific circumstances, and then decide, follow the Holy Spirit's leading.
Do you mean justified or permissible?
Permissible, not,
You keep using the word justified, and I'm wondering if you should use permissible.
okay.
If we look at the early church, none of them actually served in the military. So if we evaluate that, shouldn't we be like the early church, since it was closest to the original scripture, to the original people?
Yeah, and that's a good point, and I will address it on two heads. The first one is, I think it was 2nd or 3rd century, there actually was an almost entire Roman legion composed of Christian soldiers. So the claim that Christians didn't participate in the military is not quite right. And second, the reason that Christians directly after Jesus' life, the very early church, after Acts, did not participate in the military was not because they objected to military service. It was because in order to participate in the military, they had to offer incense to an idol or to the emperor. That is why the early Christians did not participate in war.
Wow. Some of these questions we ought to write down and ask.
If we're really getting walloped, one of us can write down. So we can never go. Yeah, Dr. Owen covered that one in class. So I asked him.
I don't have any questions. Does anybody else? How many minutes was that?
That was 8:25.
Okay. Good.
Point seven.
Excellent answers.
Thank you.
Oh no.
Make sure the